They say small towns hide big secrets. And I used to believe that mine was different. Quiet roads, tidy lawns, neighbors who smiled but never stayed too long. We had rules, sure, but no one ever questioned where they came from or who really enforced them. That all changed the day a letter showed up in my mailbox, signed by someone I didn't vote for, quoting rules I never agreed to. That's when I realized this wasn't just about overgrown grass or mailbox paint. This was about power. The quiet kind. The kind that creeps in with a clipboard and a smile, then dares you to fight back. So I did. And what happened next turned one quiet front porch into the front line of a war for something much bigger. Ash Bluff, Virginia was the kind of place where time moved a little slower, and most people still waved from their porches. Gravel roads wove through the rolling hills, past old barns and white fences that had seen better decades. The town itself barely made the map, but the people were proud. Proud of their land, their privacy, and most of all, their freedom. Agnes McBride had lived on the edge of town for nearly 30 years. Her two-story farmhouse stood proudly at the top of Sycamore Ridge, a little worn at the edges, but solid, like the woman who lived in it. Paint peeled in some corners, the front porch creaked when the wind hit just right, and a cast-iron rooster spun crookedly on the weather vane above the roof. But Agnes wouldn't change a damn thing. She wasn't like most of her neighbors. At 67, she'd already lived 2 lifetimes. A retired military intelligence officer turned defense law consultant, Agnes didn't just know how to keep quiet. She knew exactly when to speak, and more importantly, how to strike when needed. After her husband died 10 years ago, she found peace in silence, in the rhythm of chopping wood, baking cornbread, and walking her dog whiskey before dawn. That peace shattered the morning the SUV showed up. It was a Wednesday. Agnes was sipping her black coffee from a chipped mug, flipping through the classifieds for fun. The sound of gravel crunching drew her gaze through the lace curtains. A brand-new black Cadillac Escalade crept up her drive like a wolf in silk. She stood slowly, watching as the driver's door opened and a woman stepped out, heels clicking on gravel, crisp beige suit, clipboard in hand. Agnes knew trouble when she saw it. Carolyn Dewhurst looked like she belonged behind a reception desk, not on a dirt road in rural Virginia. Her hair was perfectly sprayed into a neat bob, her nails French-tipped and weapon-like. She marched up the path with 2 uniformed men flanking her, broad-chested, buzz-cut, each wearing matching dark blue polos embroidered with the letters Orca. Agnes squinted. What the hell is Orca? By the time the woman knocked, Agnes had stepped out onto the porch, arms folded. Whiskey let out a low growl beside her. "Can I help you?" Agnes asked, flatly. "Good morning. My name is Carolyn Dewhurst. I'm president of the Oak Ridge Community Alliance, Orca for short. We're the homeowners association, now managing this district." Agnes said nothing. Carolyn extended a manila envelope. "We're here to inform you that your property is currently in violation of 5— Nope! Agnes cut her off. Carolyn blinked. "Excuse me. You're not my HOA. I opted out before y'all were even formed. This house sits on independent land. Always has, always will. I think you'll find that the zoning was recently amended. You're part of the new inclusion plan. I suggest you review the attached documents. I suggest you turn around and drive off my land." One of the men shifted his weight forward. Agnes shot him a glare so cold it could have cracked asphalt. Carolyn's smile flattened. "Ma'am, refusal to comply will result in fines and legal actions. We're trying to maintain uniform standards. It's nothing personal." "That's where you're wrong," Agnes said, stepping down one stair. "Anytime someone threatens my property, it becomes very personal." She turned, walked back to the porch, and pulled from behind the bench a long wooden sign she had painted the year her husband died. It read in thick white lettering, "Private property. No HOA allowed." She planted it into the soil just below the porch steps and stood behind it, arms crossed. "You've been informed," she said calmly. Carolyn stood silent for a beat, then pivoted on her heel. "We'll be back," Agnes nodded. "I'll be here." As the SUV backed out and disappeared down the road, Agnes felt a familiar tightening in her gut. Not fear. Calculation. She had the sense this wasn't just a power play. This was a test run. They were looking for weak points. She poured another cup of coffee, leaned on the porch post, and whispered to herself, "Let them come. Let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes." What she didn't know yet was that this wasn't just a turf dispute. It was the opening move in a dangerous game. One that would involve neighbors turning on neighbors, a buried history of fraud, and a woman forced to choose between peace and justice. And Agnes McBride never walked away from a fight that mattered. Agnes didn't expect them to return so quickly. But then again, she knew intimidation tactics rarely worked unless they were persistent. It started with a letter, taped to her mailbox 2 days after the visit. No envelope, just a bold red heading. Notice of non-compliance. It accused her of everything from unsightly property maintenance to unauthorized signage, citing obscure clauses supposedly adopted by majority vote of the Oak Ridge Community Alliance. Agnes snorted. She knew that was a lie. No vote had ever reached her mailbox. And as far as she was concerned, no authority existed beyond her fence line. Still, it was more than just paper. It was an escalation. She tossed the letter on the kitchen table and poured herself a whiskey. At noon. She sipped it slowly, thinking. The next day, a knock came at 6:45 a.m. It wasn't a polite tap either. It was the type of knock designed to jolt you out of bed and make you answer fast. When Agnes opened the door, still in her flannel shirt and slippers, 2 men in the same Orca-branded polos stood at the steps. One held a clipboard. The other held a smartphone, already recording. "Ma'am, we're here to document the violations and photograph the infractions," the clipboard guy announced. "Step off my porch," she said, voice still groggy but sharp. They ignored her. The man with the camera took a wide-angle shot of the porch, zoomed in on the sign, then aimed at her window shutters. She stepped forward and planted herself between the lens and her home. "You take another step on my property," she said, "and I'll consider it trespassing under Virginia State Code 418.2/119. "Ma'am," clipboard guy said, "you've been notified. You're already in non-compliance." "I'm not under your jurisdiction," she snapped. "And this is the last warning I'm giving." They left eventually, but not without muttering something about documenting resistance. Agnes stood in the doorway until the SUV disappeared down the road again, heart pounding not with fear, but fury. By that evening, she'd filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department. Nothing came of it. That's when she realized something was off. The deputy who took her call seemed distracted. He mentioned community initiatives and peaceful dispute resolution. She asked him plainly if the Oak Ridge Community Alliance had any legal standing to enforce anything on her land. He hesitated. "That's a civil matter, ma'am." Translation, they weren't going to help. Agnes clicked off the call and stared at her phone. She knew exactly what this was. Coordinated pressure, legal bullying, manufactured authority. It wasn't the first time she'd seen it. She'd spent years overseas, watching small governments and organizations use structure and fear to gain control. The uniforms, the titles, the forms, they were all props in a stage play designed to make people comply. But she wasn't most people. She pulled open the heavy wooden trunk beneath her staircase, removed a sealed manila folder marked Land Titles and Property Rights, McBride Estate, and spread out the documents on her dining room table. Deeds, survey maps, exemption letters, each notarized and certified. Then she went further. She opened her old laptop, one she hadn't used in years, and typed into the search bar, Oak Ridge Community Alliance, Ash Bluff. Nothing official came up. No incorporation papers, no state filings. The only hits were from a Facebook group, a website built on a free Wix domain, and a few Google Docs labeled Community Codebook, Draft. Amateurs. They were posing as an HOA, but had no legal standing. That meant they were vulnerable. But even more disturbing was what she found next. Buried in a public tax parcel database, she found a zoning amendment filed 2 months earlier, one that reclassified several independent properties in Ash Bluff, including hers, as community-managed estates. The document was signed off by Deputy Zoning Director Thomas Dewhurst. Dewhurst, Carolyn's last name. Agnes sat back in her chair. This wasn't incompetence. It was a coordinated land grab. They were slowly tightening control around the neighborhood, turning independent homeowners into members of a group they never consented to join, rewriting zoning lines, and hoping no one noticed. And now she did. She grabbed her phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. "Sasha Kane," the voice on the other end answered, brisk and clear. "It's Agnes McBride." A pause, then, Well, I wondered when you'd call." "I've got a potential case of land fraud, civil coercion, and possibly zoning corruption in Ash Bluff," Agnes said, without preamble. Sasha's tone shifted. "You've got proof?" "Enough to light a fire under someone." "Send me everything." "And Agnes?" "Yeah?" "You picked one hell of a fight," Agnes smiled. "They picked it. I'm just finishing it." She hung up and leaned back, her eyes fixed on the porch window where the late afternoon sun hit the wooden sign. Private property, no HOA allowed. The line had been drawn. Now it was time to defend it. The next week in Ash Bluff felt like a slow tremor building beneath the earth. Agnes didn't post to social media. She didn't rant at the town hall or yell from her porch. Instead, she worked quietly. She scanned every letter, photo, zoning document, and email chain she could get her hands on, creating a digital archive that Sasha Kane, now a rising federal civil litigator, would later call one of the most meticulously organized grassroots legal arsenals she'd ever seen. But Agnes knew she couldn't take down a network alone. That's when she started knocking on doors. Not everyone answered. Some peered through blinds and turned away. Others opened cautiously, hesitating when they saw her. Her reputation in the neighborhood was mixed. Some thought she was just an eccentric old war vet with a guard dog and too many wind chimes. Others admired her independence. Most, however, were just afraid of the HOA, of being targeted, of rocking the boat. Until she knocked on the Rivers house. Evelyn and Mark Rivers had lived across the street from Agnes for a decade. Quiet, polite, 2 kids and a terrier. They always waved, but never talked much. Agnes figured they preferred it that way. But this time, when Evelyn opened the door and saw Agnes holding a binder under her arm, she didn't close it. Agnes spoke softly. "I know they fined you last year for the swing set." Evelyn blinked. "How?" "They posted it in one of the HOA group chats before they locked me out." Evelyn looked down. "They said it was a safety issue. They told us if we didn't remove it, we'd face a lawsuit. Mark lost his job 2 months earlier. We didn't want to risk it." Agnes held out the binder. "I have a lawyer now. Not just for me. I'm building a case. But I need others to speak up." Evelyn hesitated. Then, "Come in." That night, the stories poured out. Evelyn and Mark weren't the only ones. The Silvas, a retired couple on fixed income, were fined $400 for leaving their trash bins visible from the street. Tommy Ruiz, a disabled veteran, received a warning of community expulsion for parking his truck with the wheelchair lift in his own driveway. Sandra, a single mom, had been randomly selected for a monthly neighborhood inspection 4 months in a row, each time resulting in minor citations and fees she couldn't afford. The pattern was chillingly clear. The HOA, or ORCA, as it insisted on calling itself, was targeting residents selectively. Those who were vulnerable, those who wouldn't fight back. Until now. Agnes compiled their testimonies, organizing everything into a case file. She even tracked down the original deeds of several properties, many of which clearly stated, "Not subject to HOA enforcement." She looped in Sasha regularly. The former intern had blossomed into a relentless force in the courtroom. When Sasha reviewed the files, her voice came through the speakerphone, low and electric with outrage. "This isn't just intimidation, Agnes. This is systemic abuse, zoning manipulation, and likely criminal conspiracy." "Can we bring them down?" Agnes asked. "We don't need to bring them down," Sasha replied. "We're going to expose them and let them collapse under their own weight." Word spread, first in whispers, then in group texts. Then, for the first time in years, neighbors began gathering, not under the HOA's watch, but in living rooms, around backyard fire pits, in garages. Someone printed stickers. Orca equals fraud. Someone else started a subreddit. The fear was crumbling. One story inspired another. Like dominoes, people began to share. About Carolyn Dewhurst's connections to the zoning board. About how she'd sold her previous house at triple market value right after having a neighbor fined into foreclosure. About how she'd rewritten the community rules 10 times in 2 years, each time making enforcement easier and opposition harder. And then came the breaking point. A quiet man named Reggie Bell, who'd barely spoken to anyone since his wife passed, came to Agnes one morning with a flash drive. "It's from my Ring camera," he said. "Thought you should see it." The footage was from 3 weeks earlier, late at night. 2 men in dark hoodies were tampering with Agnes's mailbox. They weren't stealing anything, they were placing something. When Agnes and Sasha enhanced the video and slowed it down, they found it. A small, unregistered GPS tracker tucked beneath the post, taped under a false panel. They weren't just watching her property. They were tracking her. Agnes stared at the screen, her jaw set. "This just became federal," Sasha said, dialing her direct contact at the DOJ. "We're escalating." The community had gone from silence to outrage. Agnes looked out her window that night and saw something she hadn't seen in years. People talking freely on their porches. No HOA patrols, no clipboards, just neighbors. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, she knew she wasn't fighting it alone. The Department of Justice didn't knock. They arrived. 4 black government SUVs rolled quietly down Sycamore Ridge, 2 days after Sasha escalated the case. Agents in dark suits began canvassing the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, body cameras active. They weren't local. They didn't smile. And they weren't here to talk it out. Agnes watched it all from her porch, sipping her morning coffee with the same calm she wore like armor. The moment the lead agent introduced himself, Special Agent Nolan from the DOJ's Public Integrity Section, Agnes knew things were finally turning. "We've reviewed the footage," he said, sitting across from her on the porch swing. "The tracker, the zoning amendment, the HOA's unregistered status. It's a mess." Agnes leaned forward. "You haven't seen the bank statements yet," and she handed him the newest file. A neighbor who worked in finance had obtained internal Orca spreadsheets through what he coyly called a strategic IT hiccup. The documents revealed HOA dues being siphoned into shell accounts tied to a company called Blue Haven Consulting. Blue Haven was registered under Eli Dewhurst, Carolyn's husband. On paper, Blue Haven was a property valuation advisory. In reality, it hadn't filed a tax return in 2 years. But it had received over $430,000 in HOA deposits since its creation. Most of those deposits came within 60 days of zoning updates, or forced home upgrades. "This is racketeering," Nolan muttered, under the cover of civil enforcement. Sasha arrived that same afternoon. Flying in from D.C., she wasted no time. Her presence lit up the neighborhood like a flare. When people saw a federal prosecutor and DOJ agents walking side by side with Agnes, everything shifted. People came forward in droves. A contractor revealed he'd been strongly encouraged by Carolyn to quote 40% above market rate on mandatory home repairs, splitting profits with Orca. A former HOA treasurer admitted she quit after finding a maintenance fund, funneling money directly into a private account under Carolyn's maiden name. And most damning of all, a whistleblower from inside the county zoning office confessed. Carolyn had bribed her husband, Deputy Zoning Director Thomas Dewhurst, to alter digital zoning maps. In exchange, she received lucrative backdoor real estate deals on problem homes that could be bought cheap and resold under new HOA rules. Everything fit. The fines, the threats, the tracker. Even the community codebook, constantly rewritten to fit new targets, was part of the playbook. Ash Bluff hadn't just been harassed. It had been harvested. Agnes sat in silence as Sasha and Nolan laid out the federal charges on the table. Wire fraud, real estate fraud, abuse of municipal powers, conspiracy to extort, racketeering, evidence tampering. "It's a textbook case," Sasha said, flipping through the files. "And you just built it from a porch swing with a binder." But Agnes didn't smile. Instead, her voice turned low. "There's one more thing." She opened a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Inside were 2 photographs, printed from the ring footage. In one, a tall man with a buzz cut tucked the GPS tracker into her mailbox. In the other, his face was partially visible, just enough for facial recognition. Agnes tapped the image. "That's Jason Lorne. He's ex-Army. I trained him 15 years ago. Quiet, capable, loyal. But the last I heard, he was working for a private security contractor." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "You think he was hired?" "I don't think. I know. This was coordinated intimidation. Carolyn wasn't just collecting money. She was hiring muscle." That changed everything. Now it wasn't just financial fraud. It was targeted coercion under color of authority. A federal crime. Sasha and Nolan exchanged a look. "Okay," Sasha said, standing. "Then it's time we knock on Carolyn's door." Base. That evening, as the sun dipped below the Blue Ridge horizon, a fleet of federal agents walked up to the Dewhurst residence. Agnes didn't follow. She stayed on her porch, hands folded, watching from a distance. The knock was firm. The pause was long. And when Carolyn finally opened the door, wearing her usual beige cardigan, her smile was gone. She didn't speak. She didn't resist. She just looked past the agents, toward Agnes. They locked eyes. For the briefest moment, Carolyn looked like she might say something. Apologize, explain, beg. But Agnes just sipped her coffee and turned away. Some truths don't need to be heard to be understood. As Carolyn was led to the black SUV, the neighborhood was completely silent. Not a single door opened. Not one voice protested. Because they all knew the silence had finally been broken, and truth had found its voice. The news hit the town like a thunderclap. Federal raid on HOA president's home. Allegations of fraud, extortion, and zoning corruption. Local headlines lit up the next morning. And by noon, regional outlets had picked up the story. A small community in Ash Bluff had turned into the epicenter of a sweeping federal investigation. And at the heart of it all stood Agnes McBride's worn-out front porch. Sasha's team wasted no time. Warrants had been issued not only for Carolyn and her husband, but for 3 additional Orca board members, including the smug compliance officer who had once filmed Agnes at 6 a.m. That man was now under investigation for unauthorized surveillance and harassment. And his phone had plenty to say. Texts, videos, even audio files. The full picture was uglier than anyone had expected. Orca hadn't just bent the rules. It had created them, modified them, and enforced them with intimidation, financial pressure, and strategic legal threats. The so-called HOA had no state registration, no tax filings, and no community vote records. It existed entirely on the illusion of authority, backed by threats and silence. That illusion was now shattered. But while federal agents were doing their job, Agnes was doing hers. She hosted a meeting on her property, the first true neighborhood gathering in over 5 years. Folding chairs spread across the lawn, paper cups of lemonade, a chalkboard with a single phrase written across it. What comes next is up to us. People came, slowly at first, then in waves. The same people who once whispered in fear now stood side by side, many offering confessions, apologies, and support. Tommy Ruiz raised his hand. Do we have to keep paying dues while the investigation happens? Agnes shook her head. Not if there's no legal HOA left to collect them. Evelyn Rivers stood. What about the money we already paid? Thousands. Gone. Sasha, sitting nearby, nodded. We're building a class action case. If we win, and I think we will, you'll be entitled to restitution. As someone else asked, and the properties that were rezoned, can they undo that? Special Agent Nolan, present in a rare moment of openness, spoke plainly. We're working with the county to reverse those changes. It won't be overnight, but legally, none of those maps will hold up under scrutiny. For the first time in years, people smiled, laughed, clapped. Still, Agnes felt the weight in her bones. It wasn't over yet. That night, a knock came at her door. It was Reggie Bell, the quiet man who'd shared the ring footage. He held a box in his arms, old files. Not just HOA notices, but contracts, legal deeds, letters. My wife, she kept everything, he said, eyes misting. She always knew something was wrong. I ignored it. I thought keeping my head down was safer. Agnes took the box gently. Thank you, Reggie. But just as she turned, he said something that stopped her cold. Carolyn used to visit her, before she died. Said if we didn't support the initiative, we'd lose the house. My wife, she cried for days. Agnes clenched her jaw. She threatened a dying woman. Reggie nodded. They'll say it's just fraud. But what they did, it was cruelty. She placed the box beside her desk and sat for hours that night, flipping through old documents by lamplight. There were more stories here, deeper stories. Elderly residents pushed into silence. Renters tricked into buying community-backed packages. A teenager fined for hanging a pride flag. Hidden behind HOA lingo were real people, broken down by rules that had no right to exist. The DOJ's job was legal, but Agnes's job was personal. She crafted a letter to the people of Ash Bluff. This neighborhood isn't a code book. It's not a PDF of made-up rules. It's us, and the time of being afraid is over. What they stole wasn't just money. It was our ability to trust each other. Let's take it back, not by revenge, but by remembering that no amount of fine print can replace standing up together. The letter spread fast, posted at the grocery store, printed in the local paper, shared online. It reached people who had once looked away and pulled them back in. And then, on a quiet Tuesday, the fall became complete. The Commonwealth of Virginia, following the DOJ's lead, issued a formal order dissolving the Oak Ridge Community Alliance. Their bank accounts? Frozen. Their records? Seized. Their properties? Audited. Carolyn and her husband? Indicted on 14 felony counts each. Agnes stood once more on her porch, the same weathered sign beside her steps. Private property. No HOA allowed. But now, something was different. A small plaque had been placed beside it, gifted by neighbors. Etched in brass, it read, "In honor of the one who never bowed." She ran her fingers over the letters, then looked out at the hills. The war was nearly over, but the rebuilding had just begun. 6 months had passed since the last of the Orca board members entered a courtroom in shackles. The weather was shifting. Spring had taken hold in Ash Bluff. Magnolia trees bloomed, porch swings creaked again, and laughter, long absent from the cul-de-sacs, returned in the form of children racing bikes across sidewalks, once regulated to silence. And at the center of it all, as always, sat Agnes McBride. Her porch had changed. The old private property, No Hoey allowed sign still stood, but it was joined now by a new one. Community meeting. All welcome. No dues, just neighbors. The community had chosen to rebuild, not through bureaucracy, but through honesty. Every other Sunday, they gathered under the oak trees beside the field that once played host to fake rulebooks and silent fear. Now there were lawn chairs, potlucks, local musicians. A chalkboard was set up, not for rules, but for ideas. Community garden, neighborhood book swap, Saturday volunteer cruise. Agnes never sat at the head of the circle. She didn't need to. Her voice carried weight, not because of a title, but because she never asked for one. One sunny morning, Evelyn Rivers approached her after a gathering, clutching a letter. "I wanted you to see this," she said, handing it over. "It's from my son's school. He wrote an essay about a local hero." Agnes smiled as she unfolded it. The handwriting was crooked, the language earnest. Ms. McBride never yelled. She just stood up and wouldn't move, even when bad people told her to. That's what brave looks like. Agnes blinked away the sting behind her eyes. But the moment that truly marked the beginning of something new came 1 week later. A man in a gray suit showed up at her door, unannounced, but not unwelcome. His name was Richard Carver, a state land commission officer. He held a folder under one arm, looking out at the open field beside her home. "This used to be zoned for controlled community development," he said. Agnes nodded. "I know." "Not anymore," he added. "That was reversed after your case. But that's not why I'm here." He opened the folder. "We want to formally designate this area as protected open space. Resident managed, no state control, no third-party HOAs. And we'd like you to lead the Land Trust Committee." Agnes raised an eyebrow. "I'm not interested in running anything." He smiled. "We figured. That's why we're calling it a stewardship, not a presidency. You're not expected to lead, just to keep the wolves out." She looked at the signature line. The document bore the state seal. It was real. It was legal. And it gave the community autonomy with protection, not from control, but from the corruption of false control. She signed it. That evening, at the community bonfire, she didn't announce it with fanfare. She simply stood, held up the paper and said, "We're free now. Let's make sure we stay that way." Applause broke out. Kids danced. Music played. As the fire crackled, someone leaned over and asked her, "Do you ever wish you'd just joined the HOA when they first asked?" Agnes chuckled, slow and dry. "If I had," she said, "we'd all still be paying for trash bin violations and lawn gnomes." Laughter erupted. As the sky darkened into stars, Agnes sat quietly, sipping cider, the voices of her neighbors all around her. What they had built wasn't perfect, but it was real. No boards, no hidden fees, no surveillance, just people. And as the moon rose over Ash Bluff, it illuminated a truth Agnes had always known. The strongest communities aren't built on rules. They're built on trust. And trust, once broken, once buried beneath intimidation, fraud, and fire, had finally grown back, stronger, deeper, and utterly, gloriously free.